At exactly 7:43 p.m. on Christmas Eve, my father slid a check across the dining table toward me, looked me straight in the eyes, and said calmly, "Sign this, Natalie. It's the only way you stay in this family." The amount printed on the check was $125,000. The memo line read just 3 words, "Inheritance Release Agreement." And I didn't know it yet, but signing that paper would have erased me from my parents' will forever, while quietly transferring something far more valuable into my older sister's control. Something I wouldn't discover until 2 years later. Something that would destroy our family beyond repair. If you've ever been pressured by the very people who were supposed to protect you, stay with me. And if stories about toxic family betrayal and slow, precise revenge resonate with you, consider subscribing, because what happened after that night proves one thing: karma doesn't rush, but it never forgets. My name is Natalie Brooke Sullivan. I was 31 years old that Christmas, living in Portland, Oregon, working as a licensed structural draftsman for a mid-sized engineering firm called Cascade Design Group. I wasn't wealthy. I wasn't struggling. I was stable, the kind of stable that comes from quiet discipline rather than dramatic success. I earned about $74,000 a year, designing commercial building plans and safety compliance drawings, a job that required patience, precision, and long hours staring at digital blueprints. That profession would later become very relevant. My older sister, Rebecca Ann Sullivan, was the opposite. 2 years older, charismatic, ambitious, and always the center of attention. She worked in real estate development and had a talent for turning charm into leverage. Our parents adored her, not openly, not in words, but in the subtle ways that shape a childhood. The better birthday gifts, the quicker forgiveness, the pride in their voices when they spoke about her. Our parents, Thomas Edward Sullivan and Linda Marie Sullivan, owned a small but profitable commercial property management business in Portland. They managed several mid-sized retail buildings and warehouse spaces across the metro area, properties worth millions collectively, though they always downplayed their wealth. Growing up, I was the reliable one. Rebecca was the brilliant one. It sounds harmless, but labels like that carve permanent grooves in a family. By the time we were adults, the difference had become obvious. Rebecca attended investor dinners with my parents. I was invited mostly to holiday meals. Still, I believed stubbornly that fairness existed somewhere beneath that imbalance. That belief died on Christmas Eve. Dinner that night began normally. Roast turkey cranberry sauce, my mother's elaborate table setting with gold-rimmed plates she only used twice a year. Rebecca sat beside our father, discussing a new mixed-use development project she was involved in. I listened quietly, as usual. Then, after dessert, my father stood, left the room, and returned holding a thin envelope. He placed it directly in front of me. "Natalie," he said evenly, "this is something we need to finalize before the new year." I opened the envelope, expecting perhaps a holiday bonus check from the family business, something they sometimes did. Instead, I found 2 documents, the check and a legal release form. I skimmed the heading and felt my stomach tighten. Voluntary waiver of future inheritance rights. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Then I noticed Rebecca watching me. Not surprised, not confused, just waiting. "You want me to give up my inheritance?" I asked quietly. My mother spoke before my father could answer. "It's not like that," she said quickly. "This is about protecting the family business structure." I looked at Rebecca. Her eyes didn't waver. "It's cleaner this way," she added calmly. Cleaner. That word echoed in my mind. Cleaner for who? My father leaned forward slightly. "You've chosen a different life path," he said. "You're not involved in the business. Rebecca is. This ensures continuity." Continuity. Another word that sounded reasonable, until you looked at what it really meant. They weren't offering me a choice. They were offering me a buyout, a permanent one. I remember asking the most obvious question. Why now? That's when Rebecca answered, and her voice carried a calm certainty that chilled me. Because we're restructuring ownership next quarter, she said. It needs to be finalized before investors review the asset portfolio. Investors. Asset portfolio. Suddenly, this wasn't just about inheritance decades in the future. It was about something happening now, something financial, something strategic. And that's when I noticed a second document attached beneath the waiver, a property schedule listing multiple buildings, and one address circled in red ink, an address I recognized instantly. The North Harbor Industrial Complex, a massive warehouse property my parents had purchased years earlier and quietly held ever since. I worked on renovation compliance drawings for that property 2 years earlier, and I knew something no one else at that table realized I knew. The land beneath that warehouse wasn't just commercial. It had recently been rezoned for high-density, mixed-use development. Its value had nearly tripled, which meant this inheritance waiver wasn't just symbolic. It was tied to a very specific asset, one they clearly didn't want me to have any claim to. I looked up slowly. "You're not asking me to give up future inheritance," I said. "You're asking me to give up my rights to the harbor property before it gets redeveloped." For the first time, Rebecca's expression flickered, just slightly, and that tiny reaction confirmed everything. My father's voice hardened. "This isn't a negotiation," he said. "It's a decision we've already made." That was the moment something inside me shifted permanently. Not anger, not heartbreak, but clarity. Because in that instant, I understood something important. They weren't protecting the family. They were protecting control. And control matters more than fairness in families built on power. Before I tell you what I did next, I want to ask you something. If you were sitting there on Christmas Eve with your parents asking you to sign away your future rights for a check that looked generous but hid a deeper motive, what would you do? Would you sign to keep the peace or refuse and risk becoming the outsider permanently? Because at that table, holding that pen, I realized something else. Rebecca wasn't nervous. She wasn't uncertain. She was confident, as if she knew something I didn't. And I didn't understand why. Not yet. I only knew one thing for certain. That night, if I signed that paper, I would lose far more than an inheritance. But if I refused, I might trigger a conflict that would tear our family apart forever. And at that moment, I still didn't know which outcome would be worse. I didn't sign. Not at 7:44 p.m., not at 8:00, not even when my father pushed the pen closer to my hand with that slow, controlled movement he used when he wanted to remind people who was in charge. Instead, I did something small, something quiet, something Rebecca didn't expect. I read every line carefully, because my job as a structural draftsman had taught me a rule that applied to more than buildings. The most dangerous problems are hidden in the fine print. And as I scanned the waiver, I noticed something strange. It wasn't just a simple inheritance release. It referenced a specific legal instrument, Amended Sullivan Family Holding Trust, version 3.2. Version 3.2. That meant there had been earlier versions. And this wasn't just about removing me from a future will. This was about modifying an active trust structure. That distinction matters a lot in U.S. estate law, because wills distribute assets after death. Trusts control assets while people are still alive, which meant this wasn't about inheritance someday. This was about ownership now. I looked up slowly. "You're restructuring the trust," I said. My father's eyes narrowed. He hadn't expected me to understand that immediately. "Yes," he replied shortly. Rebecca leaned back in her chair, arms crossed. "It's standard business planning," she added. "You wouldn't be involved anyway." That word again, involved. It sounded harmless, but it wasn't. Because under trust law, beneficiaries don't need to be involved to retain rights. Removing one always requires a reason. And usually, That reason involves protecting someone else's control. I flipped to the second page. That's when I saw the clause that made my stomach drop. In exchange for compensation, the undersigned agrees to waive all present and future claims to ownership, profit participation, or development rights associated with trust. Asset 7B. Asset 7B. The harbor property. The one circled in red. I looked at Rebecca again. She met my gaze calmly, too calmly, like someone waiting for a predictable reaction. And suddenly, something clicked in my mind. A memory from 3 months earlier. A conversation at work. Our firm had been approached by a developer requesting preliminary zoning compliance analysis for a large redevelopment project in the North Harbor District. The project name had been redacted in the internal documents, but the parcel number matched the Sullivan warehouse property exactly, which meant one thing. Rebecca wasn't just involved in redevelopment plans, she was already negotiating them, and she needed to eliminate my legal claim before those negotiations became public. I placed the documents down slowly. How much is the redevelopment deal worth? I asked. Silence fell across the table. My mother's fork clinked lightly against her plate. Rebecca's expression tightened, just enough to confirm I had hit the truth. That's not relevant, my father said sharply. It is, I replied calmly, because you're asking me to give up a percentage stake, not an inheritance. Rebecca leaned forward then, and for the first time, her voice lost its smoothness. You're overestimating your position, she said. No, I answered quietly. I'm calculating it. Before I continue, let me ask you something. If you discovered your family wasn't just asking you to step aside, but was actively removing you before a major financial deal, would you confront them immediately, or would you pretend not to understand and wait? Because in that moment, I realized something critical. Rebecca believed she had control of the situation, which meant she might reveal more if she thought I was still confused. So I stayed calm, very calm. I need time to review this, I said evenly. My father shook his head. This must be signed tonight. Why, I asked. His answer came too quickly. Because the amendment filing deadline is December 31st. There it was, a timeline, a legal pressure point, meaning they were rushing. And people rush only when they fear losing leverage. Rebecca exhaled sharply. Natalie, she said, her tone softening artificially. This isn't personal. You'll receive $125,000 immediately. That's generous. Generous. I almost smiled, because she was using a classic negotiation tactic. Frame the payout as a favor, not compensation. I looked at the check again. $125,000. It sounded large, but I knew the harbor property's rezoning value estimate from internal zoning reports. Roughly $4.8 million after redevelopment approval, which meant my legal trust share could be worth hundreds of thousands, possibly more. I asked the simplest question. What happens if I don't sign? That's when my father's tone changed completely. Cold, flat, final. Then you will be excluded from all future family decisions, he said. You will no longer receive any financial support or trust benefits. In other words, sign or become an outsider. My mother finally spoke, her voice trembling slightly. We're trying to avoid conflict, she said. But that sentence revealed something deeper. You don't avoid conflict unless you expect it, which meant they knew this decision was unfair. Rebecca stood then and walked around the table toward me. She placed her hand lightly on my shoulder, a gesture that looked comforting, but felt controlling. You always said you wanted independence, she murmured. This is your chance. I met her eyes, and for the first time in years, I saw something beneath her confidence. Not cruelty, not hatred, but fear. That realization changed everything. Because Rebecca wasn't just trying to secure control. She was trying to secure it before something happened, something she believed might threaten her deal. I folded the documents carefully and slid them back across the table. I'm not signing tonight, I said calmly. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. My father's face hardened, Rebecca's hand slowly withdrew from my shoulder, and my mother closed her eyes, as if she had expected this outcome all along. What I didn't know then was that refusing to sign that night would trigger a chain reaction, one that would uncover a secret amendment hidden deep inside the trust documents. An amendment that had been added quietly, without my knowledge, months earlier, and that amendment contained a clause so shocking it would explain why Rebecca had been so desperate to remove me before the end of the year. Because it wasn't just about the harbor property, not even close. It was about something far more valuable and far more personal, something tied directly to my name. At 9:12 a.m., 3 days after Christmas, I walked into the Multnomah County Records Office with a folder under my arm and a question that had refused to leave my mind since Christmas Eve. Why were they so desperate to remove me from the trust before December 31st? Because deadlines like that are rarely random. They're usually tied to something scheduled to happen, something that changes ownership, or transfers power, or exposes risk. I hadn't told my parents I was going there. I hadn't told Rebecca either. In fact, I hadn't spoken to any of them since Christmas Eve. Not after my father's final message the next morning. Let us know when you're ready to sign. No greeting, no concern, just pressure. The county records office smelled faintly of paper and dust. The kind of place where legal truths sit quietly for decades until someone finally asks the right question. I approached the clerk and requested public filings related to the Sullivan Family Holding Trust. Trust documents themselves aren't fully public, but amendments tied to property transfers often are. And the harbor warehouse property was a registered commercial asset, meaning certain filings had to be recorded. After 20 minutes of searching through digital records, the clerk printed a list of amendments filed within the last 5 years. There were 3, version 3.0, version 3.1, and version 3.2, filed November 18th. Barely 6 weeks before Christmas. Barely 6 weeks before they asked me to sign away my rights. My hands stayed steady as I requested a certified copy of the amendment summary. Because one thing was already clear. They didn't just decide this suddenly. They planned it carefully. When I opened the document, the first pages looked routine. Ownership percentages adjusted. Management authority transferred to Rebecca. Standard language about operational continuity. But then, I reached the section titled Conditional Beneficiary Conversion Clause, and everything changed. The clause read, in the event that the Harbor Development Agreement is executed, the beneficiary status of Natalie Brooks Sullivan shall automatically convert from equity beneficiary to contingent liability participant unless a voluntary waiver is signed prior to December 31st. I read the sentence twice, then a third time, because it didn't make sense at first. Beneficiary to liability participant. That wasn't normal trust language. That was financial risk language. Slowly the meaning settled in. If I didn't sign the waiver, my status wouldn't remain the same. It would change, not into ownership, but into liability, which meant something very specific. The redevelopment deal tied to the harbor property wasn't just an opportunity. It involved risk, large risk, financial risk that could legally attach to anyone still listed as a beneficiary. And suddenly, Rebecca's urgency made perfect sense. They weren't just trying to exclude me. They were trying to protect themselves by shifting potential liability onto me. Before we go further, think about this. If you discovered your family was trying to remove you from an inheritance, not to deny you money, but to avoid saddling you with massive financial risk, would that change how you saw their actions? Or would it make the betrayal even worse? Because in that moment, I didn't feel relieved. I felt something colder, because this clause meant they had been planning this for months, and they never intended to explain it. I kept reading, and that's when I found the most shocking line in the entire amendment. In the absence of a signed waiver, liability obligations shall be enforceable retroactively upon execution of the development financing agreement. Retroactively, that word carries enormous legal weight. It means the liability could apply to actions taken before I even knew about the deal. My breath slowed, because now the situation was completely clear. They weren't offering me $125,000 as a buyout. They were offering it as an escape from something dangerous, something financially catastrophic. But if that was true, why didn't they just tell me? Why hide it? Why pressure me? Instead of explaining, the answer came almost immediately. Because if they explained, I might ask questions, and those questions might reveal something else, something they didn't want me to discover. I continued reading, and on the final page, I found it, a reference to a separate document. Harbor Development Financing Agreement, Confidential Attachment A. Attachment A wasn't included in the public filing, but its existence told me one thing. The real risk wasn't in the trust amendment itself. It was in whatever financing structure they had agreed to. That's when another memory surfaced. 3 weeks before Christmas, my company's internal project database had received an anonymous inquiry, a request for structural compliance review tied to a major redevelopment site in North Harbor. The project file had been marked high liability exposure, pre-construction risk, transfer model. At the time, I hadn't thought much about it. Now the connection was obvious. The redevelopment deal Rebecca was negotiating was structured to transfer liability risk to specific legal stakeholders. Stakeholders like trust beneficiaries. Like me, my hands felt cold, but my mind was calm. Because now the timeline made perfect sense. November 18th amendment filed. December waiver presented to me. December 31st, deadline before liability conversion. Everything was calculated. Everything was deliberate. I left the records office and sat in my car for a long time. Not crying, not angry, just processing. Because this wasn't just about money anymore. It was about trust. Real trust. The kind that breaks silently long before anyone notices. I kept asking myself one question. If they were trying to protect themselves from financial liability, why wasn't Rebecca listed as the primary risk holder? Why was I? That detail didn't make sense. Not yet. And that unanswered question bothered me more than anything else. Because it meant there was still a piece missing. A hidden piece. One that would explain everything. What I didn't know then was that the answer was buried inside a confidential financing contract. A contract signed not just by Rebecca, but by someone else. Someone whose involvement in the harbor project would shock me completely. Someone I trusted. Someone who had been quietly connected to this deal from the beginning. And discovering that name would change how I saw my entire family forever. At 2:18 p.m. the following Thursday, I opened a file at work that I wasn't supposed to see, and the name printed on the financing agreement made my hands go completely still. Because it wasn't my sister's name. It wasn't my father's. It wasn't even the development company's primary investor. It was someone else, someone I had trusted for years. But before I tell you whose name it was, you need to understand how I got there. Because the way I found out wasn't accidental. It was deliberate. After leaving the county records office, I couldn't shake one question. Why would the trust amendment convert my beneficiary status into liability, specifically me, instead of Rebecca, who was directly managing the project? That made no logical sense, unless someone else needed Rebecca to remain legally insulated, and someone else needed a fallback liability holder. Someone with a clean financial record. Someone stable. Someone predictable. Someone like me. I returned to Cascade Design Group the next morning and logged into our internal project database. I searched using the parcel number for the harbor warehouse property. The system returned a file labeled NHH 47 Redevelopment Compliance Pre-Assessment. I clicked it. Access denied, which meant the project had been classified as restricted. Only senior engineers and legal reviewers could open it. That alone told me something important. Projects only receive that level of restriction when liability exposure is unusually high. So I did something risky. I contacted Ethan Michael Carter. Ethan was our firm's senior structural compliance engineer, 36 years old, methodical, ethical, and someone I had worked closely with for nearly 4 years. We trusted each other professionally, and until that moment, personally too. I knocked on his office door at 2:05 p.m. He looked up from his monitor and smiled slightly. "Natalie," he said, "what's up?" I kept my tone casual. "I saw a restricted harbor redevelopment file," I said. "NH-47. I worked on that property years ago. I just wanted to understand what's happening there." His smile faded, only slightly, but enough for me to notice. "That project is complicated," he said carefully. "High-risk financing structure. Legal is handling most of it." I leaned against the doorframe. "Complicated how?" He hesitated. And in that hesitation, something shifted, because Ethan Carter never hesitated when discussing technical matters. "Before I continue, let me ask you something. If someone you trusted suddenly became cautious, not defensive, not hostile, just careful, would you sense that they knew more than they should?" Because in that moment, I knew. Ethan wasn't just aware of the project. He was involved. "I just need to understand the liability structure," I said quietly. He looked at me for a long moment, then exhaled slowly and turned his monitor slightly toward me. "This stays between us," he said. What I saw on his screen made my stomach drop, because the project overview summary listed the financing structure clearly. Primary developer, Sullivan Development Group, Rebecca Sullivan, major investor, North Star, Urban Holdings, Risk, Transfer, Guarantor, Natalie Brooks Sullivan. My name. Right there, under the word Guarantor. I didn't move, didn't speak, because sometimes shock doesn't feel explosive. It feels cold, like the air has been drained from the room. Ethan's voice was quiet. "Natalie, I thought you knew." I shook my head slowly. "No." He leaned back in his chair, his expression troubled. "This project uses a pre-construction risk transfer model," he explained. "If environmental issues or structural liabilities emerge during redevelopment, the guarantor absorbs financial responsibility." "How much responsibility?" I asked. His answer came without hesitation. "Up to $2.6 million in potential exposure." The number landed like a physical weight, because that wasn't just debt. That was life-altering liability. Bankruptcy-level liability. I swallowed carefully. How was I listed as guarantor without signing anything? Ethan hesitated again, then clicked another document open, a digital copy of the financing agreement. And there, in the guarantor section, was a scanned signature. Mine! Or something that looked like mine. Forgery, not just in trust documents, but in a binding commercial financing contract. Which meant this wasn't just a family matter anymore. It was corporate fraud. I forced myself to stay calm. "Who submitted this document?" I asked. Ethan's eyes met mine, and then he said the name that changed everything. Rebecca Sullivan and Thomas Sullivan. My father. But that wasn't the most shocking part. Ethan continued quietly. "They co-signed the guarantor verification package. That includes proof of consent." Proof of consent. Which meant they had created supporting documentation, identity verification, authorization forms, all forged, all submitted to investors. I stared at the screen, because suddenly, everything became painfully clear. The trust amendment, the waiver pressure, the December deadline, they weren't just protecting the business. They were protecting themselves by transferring catastrophic liability onto me, without my knowledge, without my consent. Before I could speak again, Ethan added something else. "There's another reason they needed this structured quickly," he said. I looked at him. "What reason?" He hesitated. Longer this time, then spoke quietly. "The environmental assessment report." My chest tightened. "What about it?" He turned the monitor again and opened a restricted engineering summary. The heading read, "Preliminary Soil Contamination Findings, NH-47 Site." The words felt like ice sliding through my chest. Because environmental contamination changes everything in redevelopment law. Cleanup liability can cost millions, and whoever holds guarantor status becomes legally responsible. Before we go further, think about this. If you discovered your own family had secretly made you legally responsible for a contaminated industrial site, would you confront them immediately? Or would you stay silent and gather proof first? Because in that moment, I realized something chilling. The harbor redevelopment deal wasn't just risky, it was dangerous. And Rebecca and my father had known that from the beginning. I closed my eyes briefly, then asked the one question that still didn't make sense. Why me? Ethan's answer came quietly. Because you have the cleanest financial record in the family. No debt, stable employment, strong credit. Investors trust profiles like yours. In other words, I was the perfect shield. What I didn't know then was that the contamination report contained an even darker detail, one that would expose not just financial betrayal, but something far more disturbing. Because buried deep inside that report was a timeline proving my father had known about the environmental risks years earlier, before he ever transferred the property into the family trust, before he ever positioned me as a beneficiary. And that meant one terrifying thing. The entire structure had been planned long before Christmas Eve, long before Rebecca's deal, long before I ever realized I was being positioned as the one person who would absorb the fallout when everything went wrong. At 3:02 p.m. that same afternoon, Ethan scrolled down to a page in the environmental report that made my entire understanding of my family collapse into something far darker than betrayal. Because the document wasn't just a recent contamination assessment. It contained a timeline, a very specific timeline. And at the top of that timeline was a date, June 14th, 2017, 7 years earlier. I leaned closer to the screen because that date wasn't random. It was the year my parents transferred the harbor warehouse property into the Sullivan Family Holding Trust. The same year, they formally added me as a beneficiary. At the time, I had thought it was a gesture of fairness, an attempt to include both daughters equally. Now, reading that timeline, I understood something horrifying. The report stated, initial soil sampling conducted by Pacific Environmental Consultants identified elevated concentrations of industrial solvents consistent with long-term chemical storage operations predating current ownership. Below that line was another sentence, one that made my stomach turn cold. Property owner was notified of contamination risks and recommended remediation protocols. Property owner. In 2017, that was my father, which meant something very specific. He knew the land was contaminated before transferring it into the family trust, before listing me as a beneficiary, before positioning the asset as part of our future inheritance. I didn't speak for several seconds, because sometimes betrayal isn't loud. It's quiet, precise, strategic, the kind that takes years to fully reveal itself. Ethan watched me carefully. Natalie, are you okay? I nodded slowly, but my voice came out flat. He knew I said. Ethan didn't respond, because he understood immediately what I meant. Before I continue, I want to ask you something. If you discovered that your parents had knowingly placed you in a legal position to absorb environmental liability years in advance, would you see it as betrayal or something even worse? Because betrayal implies emotion. What I was looking at now was planning. I kept reading, and the next section explained everything. Estimated remediation cost range $1.8 million to $3.2 million, depending on soil removal requirements. That number aligned almost exactly with the liability limit Ethan had mentioned earlier, which meant the financing structure wasn't designed to manage risk. It was designed to transfer it. I sat down in Ethan's chair because my legs suddenly felt unsteady. Why wasn't remediation done back in 2017? I asked quietly. Ethan hesitated, then answered carefully. Because the property was still profitable as an industrial warehouse. Cleanup would have required shutting down operations. In other words, my father chose profit over responsibility. And instead of fixing the contamination, he placed the property inside a trust, distributing legal exposure across beneficiaries, including me. The realization settled in slowly, painfully, because this wasn't just about Rebecca's redevelopment deal. The groundwork had been laid years earlier, before she was even involved, before the investors, before the waiver, before Christmas Eve. I asked the next question that had been building inside me. Why convert my status to liability only now? Ethan leaned forward. Because redevelopment triggers environmental disclosure laws, he said. Once you apply for zoning conversion, contamination must be reported publicly. At that point, liability becomes enforceable. And that explained everything. The trust amendment, the waiver deadline, the urgency. They weren't just trying to remove me from inheritance. They were trying to remove me from liability before disclosure. But there was still one detail that didn't make sense. A critical one. Why didn't they just handle the liability themselves? I asked. Ethan's answer came slowly. Because your father retired 3 years ago and moved most personal assets into protected trusts. Rebecca's company carries high leverage debt. Investors require a guarantor with strong personal financial stability. In other words, they couldn't absorb the risk, so they positioned me to do it. I stared at the contamination report again, and a memory surfaced. 7 years earlier, the same summer the trust was created, my father had invited me to dinner and told me proudly, "We're securing your future, Natalie." I had believed him completely. Now, I understood the truth. He wasn't securing my future. He was securing his escape. Before we go further, think about this. If someone spent years preparing to transfer a hidden financial disaster onto you without ever telling you, would you confront them immediately? Or would you wait and gather proof strong enough to make denial impossible? Because in that moment, I knew confrontation alone wouldn't be enough. They had built this structure carefully, legally, strategically. I needed something stronger than accusations. I needed evidence that couldn't be explained away. Ethan spoke again quietly. "There's something else you should know." I looked up. "What?" He hesitated, then turned the monitor once more and opened the financing agreement's final section. Personal Guarantor Activation Clause. The clause stated, upon commencement of demolition or site disturbance, the guarantor becomes immediately responsible for remediation obligations. My chest tightened. "When does demolition start?" I asked. Ethan's answer came softly. "Scheduled for January 15th, less than 3 weeks away." Which meant, if I did nothing, if I signed nothing, if I didn't act quickly, in just weeks, I would legally become responsible for millions in environmental cleanup costs. Costs I never agreed to. Costs my family knew about for years. I sat there in silence for a long time. Because anger wasn't the strongest emotion I felt. It was something colder. Clarity, the kind that comes when every piece of a puzzle finally locks into place. What I didn't know yet was that confronting my family wouldn't be the most dangerous part. The most dangerous part would come later. Because once I challenged the guarantor designation, the investors would begin investigating the original documentation. And when they did, they would discover something even worse than forgery. Something that could trigger criminal liability. Not just for Rebecca, not just for my father, but for someone else too. Someone I trusted. Someone who had been quietly involved in verifying those documents from the very beginning. And discovering that truth would change everything I thought I knew about loyalty. At 10:37 a.m. the next morning, I opened the guarantor verification package in Ethan's office, and the name listed as the certifying witness made my chest go completely still. Because it wasn't my father. It wasn't Rebecca. It wasn't a random corporate notary. It was someone I had trusted every single day for the past 4 years. Ethan Michael Carter. For a moment, the words on the screen didn't feel real. My mind refused to process them. Because Ethan wasn't just a colleague. He was the person who had trained me, when I joined Cascade Design Group. The one who stayed late, helping me learn complex compliance codes. The one who brought coffee during deadline weeks. The one who had sat across from me yesterday, concerned, careful, almost protective. And now his name was sitting under the line. Certification of identity and signature verification. I didn't speak immediately because the most dangerous kind of betrayal isn't loud. It's quiet, professional, procedural, hidden inside systems that appear legitimate. Ethan noticed the change in my expression instantly. His face tightened. "Natalie, what is it?" I turned the monitor slowly toward him and tapped the signature verification section. He read it once, then again. His color drained completely. "Wait," he said quietly. That can't be right." His voice wasn't defensive. It was shocked, genuinely shocked, which confused me more than anything. "Before I continue, I want to ask you something. If you discovered someone you trusted was linked to a document that could destroy your life, would you assume they betrayed you intentionally? Or would you question whether they were manipulated too?" Because in that moment, I didn't feel anger toward Ethan. I felt uncertainty, and uncertainty is far more dangerous. "Did you sign this verification?" I asked calmly. Ethan shook his head immediately. "No, I've never seen this before." His answer came too fast to be rehearsed, too raw to be calculated. But denial alone wasn't enough. Not when his digital signature was right there on the document. He leaned forward, zooming in on the certification page. His hands moved quickly over the keyboard, accessing internal records, cross-checking timestamps, and then he froze because the metadata revealed something unexpected. The certification file had been uploaded using his login credentials on November 22nd at 8:13 p.m. After work hours, from a remote access connection. Ethan whispered softly. "I didn't do this." I watched him carefully, and for the first time, I saw something I had never seen in him before. Fear, real fear. "Was your login ever shared?" I asked. "No," he said immediately. "That violates firm policy." But then he hesitated, and that hesitation mattered, because it meant there was something else. What I pressed quietly, he swallowed. "Rebecca came to the office that week," he said slowly. My pulse tightened. "When?" "November 21st, he replied. "She said she needed help understanding structural risk assessments for the harbor project." That aligned perfectly with the upload date. I stayed very still. "What exactly did you show her?" "Nothing confidential," he said quickly. "Just general explanations." But then his voice faltered. I logged into my workstation while she was in my office. Silence fell between us, because we both understood what that meant. "Before we go further, think about this. If someone gained access to a system through someone you trusted, would you see that person as responsible or as another victim of manipulation?" Because in that moment, the truth became painfully clear. Rebecca hadn't needed Ethan's cooperation. She only needed his access. Ethan leaned back slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "She used my login." The realization hit him fully then. "And she forged my digital certification." That changed everything. Because digital certification fraud is not just civil liability. It's criminal fraud, federal-level fraud. I sat down across from him, calm, controlled. But inside, something had shifted permanently. Because now, the pattern was undeniable. Rebecca wasn't just manipulating family relationships. She was exploiting professional systems, legal systems, trust systems, everything. Ethan spoke again, his voice strained. "I never would have done this to you," he said. "I know," I replied quietly. And I did know, because the evidence supported that conclusion. The access logs, the remote upload, the timing, everything pointed to Rebecca. But the implications were enormous, because if investors discovered the certification was fraudulent, they wouldn't just pursue civil claims. They would initiate criminal investigations. And once that happened, everything would escalate rapidly. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. "What are you going to do?" he asked. It was the question I had been asking myself since Christmas Eve. Since the waiver, since discovering the contamination, since realizing how deeply this had been planned. Before I answer that, let me ask you something. If you had proof your own sister forged documents that could bankrupt you, would you confront her immediately, or would you wait until exposing the truth would also protect you completely? Because timing matters in situations like this, more than emotion, more than confrontation. I looked at Ethan steadily. "I'm not confronting her yet," I said. His brows furrowed. "Why?" "Because right now," I replied calmly, "she still believes I don't know." And that gave me something far more valuable than anger. It gave me leverage. Ethan nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. "You're waiting," he said. "Yes," I replied. "Waiting for what?" "For the moment when denial won't be possible," I said quietly. What I didn't know yet was that moment would arrive sooner than I expected. Because once I began challenging the guarantor designation legally, the investors would conduct their own internal audit. And during that audit, they would discover something Rebecca never intended anyone to see. Something buried deep inside the financing agreement. A clause that didn't just expose fraud, it exposed motive. A motive so cold, so calculated. It would prove this entire situation wasn't just about money. It was about something far more personal and far more devastating. At 8:56 p.m. that night, I sat alone in my apartment with the guarantor document open on my laptop, staring at my forged signature, and made the most important decision of my life. I chose not to confront Rebecca, not yet, because for the first time since Christmas Eve, I understood something clearly. Silence isn't weakness. Silence is strategy. And the longer she believed I knew nothing, the more evidence she would leave behind. I closed the laptop slowly, not because I was overwhelmed, but because my mind had shifted into something colder, more precise. The same mental state I used when reviewing structural compliance drawings, when one miscalculation could collapse an entire building. In those moments, emotion doesn't help. Only clarity does. Rebecca had built a system designed to protect herself. Trust amendments, legal waivers, digital certifications, liability transfers, everything layered carefully. But like any complex structure, it had stress points. And if you apply pressure at the right place, the entire framework fails. Before I tell you what I did next, I want to ask you something. If you discovered someone had spent years quietly positioning you to absorb catastrophic risk, would you rush to confront them, or would you let them believe their plan was working until it was too late to fix? Because revenge, driven by anger, is loud, but revenge, driven by patience, is unstoppable. The next morning, I did something very deliberate. I called Margaret Elaine Whitfield, an attorney specializing in commercial liability and trust litigation. I had met her once, years earlier, during a zoning dispute review for a client project. She was known for one thing above all else: precision. When I arrived at her office at 10:14 a.m., I didn't start by telling her about family betrayal. I started with facts, dates, documents, trust amendments, environmental reports, forgery evidence, digital access logs. Because lawyers don't respond to emotion, they respond to patterns. Margaret listened without interrupting for nearly 40 minutes. Her expression remained calm, analytical. Then she folded her hands on the desk and spoke. "This isn't just a family dispute," she said. "This is a coordinated liability transfer scheme." Her words felt steady, grounded, because for the first time, someone outside the situation saw it clearly. She continued carefully. "If the guarantor certification is proven fraudulent, the financing agreement becomes legally voidable." My chest tightened slightly. "What does that mean?" "It means the investors lose their legal protection," she said. "And when that happens, they will pursue the parties who created the fraud. Rebecca, my father, anyone who participated." But Margaret wasn't finished. "There's something else," she added. She turned her monitor toward me and pointed at a section of the financing agreement I hadn't noticed before. "Personal motivation, disclosure clause." I frowned. "What is that?" It's standard in high-risk redevelopment deals, she explained. It requires disclosure of any personal conflicts of interest that could influence financial decisions. I leaned closer to read the clause, and the words beneath it made my pulse slow to an eerie calm. Because under the disclosure section, Rebecca had written a statement. In her own words, a statement she likely believed no one outside investors would ever read. It said, primary motivation for accelerated redevelopment timeline includes resolution of internal family ownership disputes related to beneficiary Natalie Sullivan, whose continued involvement presents operational risk. Operational risk. That phrase felt like ice, because it wasn't just financial language. It was personal, cold, calculated. Before we go further, think about this. If your own sister formally described you as a risk in a legal document, would it hurt more than the financial betrayal? Or would it confirm what you had always suspected? Because in that moment, something inside me settled permanently. This wasn't just about money. It was about control. Rebecca didn't see me as family. She saw me as an obstacle. Margaret looked at me carefully. This clause changes everything she said. How? I asked, quietly. Because it proves intent, she replied. Intent to remove you, not just financially, but strategically. In legal terms, intent transforms fraud from negligence into deliberate misconduct, which carries far more severe consequences. I sat back slowly. The weight of that truth felt strangely steady. Not overwhelming, not chaotic, just final. Margaret continued, if you challenge the Guarantor designation, formally, investors will conduct a full audit. And when they do, she added quietly, this disclosure statement will surface, which meant Rebecca's own words would expose her motive. Without me needing to accuse her, what happens then? I asked. Margaret's answer came calmly. Then the situation leaves family control entirely. Regulatory agencies become involved. Financial institutions initiate fraud investigations. And the people responsible lose the ability to manage the outcome. In other words, once the truth surfaced, Rebecca wouldn't just lose the deal. She would lose control of everything. I thought about that for a long moment, because revenge wasn't what I felt. What I felt was something quieter. Justice, the kind that comes not from retaliation, but from exposing reality. Before I left Margaret's office, she asked one final question. Are you prepared for what happens next? I understood what she meant. Because once I initiated legal action, there would be no going back, no private resolution, no family reconciliation. Everything would become public. Permanent, irreversible. Before I answer that, I want to ask you something. If exposing the truth meant permanently ending your relationship with your family, would you still do it? Or would you try to protect them, even after everything? Because that decision is the hardest part of any betrayal. I looked at Margaret steadily. Yes, I said quietly, I'm ready. What I didn't know yet was that Rebecca was already sensing something was wrong. Because just 3 days later, she would make a desperate move. A move so reckless, it would trigger the very audit she feared most. And once that audit began, the truth wouldn't just surface, it would explode. At 6:18 p.m., 3 days later, my phone lit up with Rebecca's name for the first time since Christmas Eve. I stared at the screen for several seconds before answering. Not because I was afraid, but because timing mattered now more than anything else. And the moment she reached out, told me something had already shifted. Her voice sounded calm when I picked up. Too calm. The kind of calm people use when they're trying to control a situation they feel slipping. Natalie, she said lightly, we need to talk. I didn't respond immediately. Silence is powerful, especially when the other person expects emotion. After a moment, I said quietly, about what? She paused, just long enough to confirm she was choosing her words carefully. The trust paperwork, she replied. You haven't signed yet. There it was. The real reason. Not concern, not family. Control. Before I continue, think about this. If someone who had spent weeks pressuring you suddenly switched to a calm, almost friendly tone, would you trust that change? Or would you recognize it as a sign they were worried? Because in that moment, I knew Rebecca wasn't calling to persuade me. She was calling to assess what I knew. "I'm still reviewing it," I said evenly. Her voice tightened slightly. "That deadline is approaching." "Yes," I replied calmly. "I'm aware." Another pause. Longer this time. And then she asked the question she had really called to ask. "Have you spoken to anyone about this?" There it was. Direct, careful, fear hidden beneath control. I kept my voice neutral. No, technically, that was true. I hadn't told anyone outside legal counsel, and she didn't need to know that. Rebecca exhaled slowly. Then her tone softened again. "Natalie, this doesn't have to become a conflict," she said. "We're trying to protect the family." Protect. That word again. But now, I understood what it really meant. Protecting themselves. From what I asked quietly, she hesitated, just briefly. And that hesitation confirmed everything. "From unnecessary complications," she said. I almost smiled, because when someone refuses to name a risk directly, it usually means they're hiding something far worse. Then she made the move that changed everything. "We can increase the compensation," she said suddenly. My pulse slowed, because that wasn't a casual offer. That was desperation. How much I asked. Her answer came quickly. $250,000. Double the original amount? In less than a week? That told me more than any document could. Before we go further, let me ask you something. If someone doubled a buyout offer overnight, would you see it as generosity or as proof they were afraid of something coming to light? Because in that moment, the truth was obvious. Rebecca wasn't negotiating. She was trying to contain damage. I stayed quiet for several seconds, letting the silence stretch, because silence forces people to reveal more. And Rebecca couldn't tolerate uncertainty. "Natalie," she said finally, "we need to finalize this before year-end disclosures." Year-end disclosures. That phrase mattered, because it confirmed what Margaret had predicted. Once financial disclosures were filed, the liability structure would become visible to investors. And if I hadn't signed, questions would begin. I spoke slowly. "What happens if I don't sign?" This time, Rebecca didn't deflect. Her voice dropped. Harder, colder. "Then the situation becomes complicated," she said. How I pressed. She hesitated, and then said something she hadn't planned to say. "You could become financially exposed." There it was, the closest she had come to admitting the truth. I kept my tone calm. Exposed to what? She didn't answer. Instead, she shifted tactics. "You don't want to get involved in business liabilities you don't understand," she said. That sentence confirmed everything, because it wasn't a warning. It was a threat disguised as concern. I ended the call a few minutes later without committing to anything, without confronting her, without revealing what I knew. And as soon as I hung up, I called Margaret. She listened carefully as I described the conversation. When I finished, she spoke only one sentence. She just triggered the audit. My chest tightened. How? By attempting to renegotiate compensation. After documentation has been filed, Margaret explained. That creates a legal record of awareness. In other words, Rebecca had just proven she knew there was risk. And that knowledge transforms liability disputes into fraud investigations. Margaret continued, "I'm filing a formal challenge to the Guarantor designation tomorrow." That meant the process would begin immediately. Investor notification, internal audits, legal review, everything. I sat in silence after the call ended, because I knew what this meant. The quiet phase was over. The preparation phase was over. Now, everything would move into the open. But there was still one question that hadn't been answered. A question that had been growing quietly inside me since reading Rebecca's disclosure statement. Why did she describe me as an operational risk? Not just financially, but personally. And that question would soon be answered in the most devastating way possible. Because once the investor audit began, they would review every communication tied to the harbor project, including internal emails. Emails Rebecca never expected anyone outside her company to read. Emails written months earlier, before Christmas, before the waiver, before I knew anything. And inside those emails was a statement that would change everything. A statement proving this wasn't just about liability. It wasn't just about money. It was about something far more personal. A motive so cold, so calculated, it would reveal the truth Rebecca had hidden for years. The truth about why she had always seen me, not as her sister, but as something else entirely. At 11:07 a.m., 2 weeks later, I sat in Margaret Whitfield's conference room, watching her scroll through a document labeled North Star, Urban Holdings, Internal Communications Audit. And the email she opened next changed everything I thought I understood about my sister. Because it wasn't about money. Not really. The audit had moved faster than anyone expected. Once Margaret filed the formal Guarantor challenge, the investors immediately launched an internal review. Their risk exposure was too high. Their legal teams too cautious. And in high-value redevelopment deals, documentation is everything, which meant they examined every contract, every signature, every communication, including private email exchanges between Rebecca and North Star's executives. Margaret turned the monitor toward me. "This one is important," she said quietly. The subject line read, "Guarantor Selection Strategy, Confidential." The email was dated September 3rd, nearly 4 months before Christmas Eve. Long before I knew anything about the redevelopment deal, long before the waiver, long before the trust amendment, Rebecca had written it. Her words, her strategy, her intent. And as I read the first sentence, my chest tightened slowly. Because it wasn't financial language, it was personal. She wrote, "Natalie is the optimal guarantor candidate due to her predictable behavioral profile and lack of assertiveness in family conflicts." I didn't move, didn't speak, because those words felt colder than any accusation. Predictable, lack of assertiveness, not sister, not family, not equal, just a risk calculation. Before we go further, let me ask you something. If you discovered someone had studied your personality, not to understand you, but to exploit your weaknesses, would that hurt more than financial betrayal? Or would it confirm what you had always suspected? Because in that moment, something inside me settled permanently. I kept reading, and the next paragraph explained everything. 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 Rebecca wrote, "Based on historical patterns, Natalie is unlikely to challenge authority figures, particularly our father. She prioritizes conflict avoidance, which significantly reduces legal risk." My hands felt cold, because she wasn't guessing. She was analyzing years of my behavior, years of family dynamics, years of emotional patterns, all reduced to a strategic profile. Margaret remained silent, giving me time, because she understood something important. Some truths need space to settle. The next line hit harder than anything before it. Additionally, Natalie's professional identity as a compliance-oriented engineer reinforces her tendency to trust documentation structures. That sentence felt almost surgical, because it wasn't just accurate, it was weaponized. She had used my strengths as tools against me. I closed my eyes briefly, not to escape, but to understand, because suddenly, memories rearranged themselves. Childhood arguments, family decisions, Rebecca always speaking for both of us, my father always siding with her, the subtle expectation that I would adapt, compromise, stay quiet. It wasn't random, it was conditioning, and Rebecca had recognized it years earlier. Before we continue, think about this. If someone close to you studied your personality, not to love you, but to predict how easily you could be controlled, would you call that manipulation or something darker? Because this wasn't impulsive betrayal. It was calculated, clinical, strategic. I opened my eyes and continued reading. The final section of the email contained the most devastating sentence of all. Rebecca wrote, "Once liability conversion is complete, Natalie's financial limitations will prevent prolonged legal resistance." I felt something shift inside my chest then. Not pain, not anger, but clarity. Because that sentence revealed her core assumption. She believed I was weak. Financially, emotionally, legally. She believed I would accept whatever happened. Because historically, I always had. Margaret spoke quietly beside me. This email proves intent, she said. Intent to exploit, intent to deceive, intent to transfer liability knowingly. In legal terms, intent transforms fraud into something far more serious. It establishes motive, and motive removes ambiguity. I leaned back slowly, because the emotional impact wasn't explosive. It was quiet, like watching a long-standing illusion dissolve completely. For years, I believed Rebecca's favoritism came from personality differences. Now, I understood the truth. She didn't just see me as less capable. She saw me as predictable, controllable, a variable she could model, like a structural load calculation. Margaret continued, "This document alone significantly strengthens your case," she said. "But there's one more detail." She scrolled down and opened a second email in the thread. This one was from a North Star executive responding to Rebecca. The reply read, "Your analysis is thorough. However, we require confirmation that no personal emotional conflicts will interfere with Guarantor compliance." Rebecca's response came 1 hour later, and it was only one sentence, but it explained everything. She wrote, "Natalie has always depended on family approval. She will comply." For a moment, the room felt completely silent, because those words weren't just strategic. They were personal, deeply personal. They revealed how Rebecca saw me, not as a sister, not as an equal, but as someone defined by emotional dependence. Before I go further, I want to ask you something. If someone you trusted believed your need for family acceptance made you easy to control, would that realization break you, or would it finally set you free? Because in that moment, something inside me became absolutely clear. Rebecca's greatest assumption was also her greatest mistake. She believed I needed her approval. She believed I needed my father's acceptance. She believed I needed the family structure to feel secure. But reading that email, I realized something powerful. I didn't. Not anymore. Margaret closed the laptop slowly. The audit findings will be presented to North Star's executive board next week, she said. What happens then? I asked quietly. They will determine whether to pursue civil claims or refer the matter for criminal investigation, which meant everything would soon become public, unavoidable, irreversible. But there was still one piece missing, one question that had lingered since the beginning. Why did Rebecca believe I would never resist? What had happened in our past that convinced her I would always remain silent? And that answer would come sooner than I expected. Because during the upcoming board review meeting, Rebecca would try one final strategy, one desperate attempt to control the narrative, an attempt that would force her to reveal a truth she had hidden for decades, a truth that had nothing to do with business, nothing to do with liability, nothing to do with money, but everything to do with our childhood. And once she spoke those words, I would finally understand why she never saw me as a sister at all. At exactly 2:31 p.m. on March 18th, Rebecca Sullivan stood at the front of North Star Urban Holdings executive boardroom, looked directly at me for the first time since Christmas Eve, and said calmly, "This entire situation is being exaggerated because Natalie has always struggled with emotional stability." The room went completely silent, because that sentence wasn't a legal defense. It was a personal attack, and it marked the beginning of her final strategy. Denial. The board review meeting had been scheduled quickly once the internal audit concluded. North Star's legal team needed answers. Investors needed protection, and Rebecca needed one last chance to explain the discrepancies before formal action began, which meant everything would happen in one room, at one time, in front of witnesses. Exactly the kind of setting where the truth becomes unavoidable. I sat beside Margaret at the long conference table, calm, still, listening, because the most powerful moment in any confrontation is not when you speak. It's when you allow someone else to reveal who they really are. Rebecca began with controlled confidence. She addressed the board, not me. There has been a misunderstanding regarding Guarantor documentation, she said smoothly. We believed Natalie had provided consent through family trust mechanisms. Denial, the first stage. Predictable? North Star's lead counsel, Daniel Harper, responded calmly. The certification logs show unauthorized digital access, he said. Can you explain how that occurred? Rebecca didn't hesitate. She shifted instantly to the second stage. Blame. Our family has experienced internal conflict for years, she said. Natalie often reacts impulsively to business decisions she doesn't fully understand. The implication was clear. If documentation appeared fraudulent, it was because I was unstable, not because she had forged anything. Before we go further, let me ask you something. If someone publicly tried to discredit your mental stability to protect themselves, would you interrupt immediately? Or would you stay silent and let them expose themselves further? Because silence in moments like this is not passive. It's pressure. Margaret placed a hand lightly on my arm. A quiet signal. Wait, let her continue. Rebecca took a breath and moved into the third stage. Victimhood. Her voice softened. Her posture shifted. I've spent years trying to hold our family business together, she said quietly. Our father's health declined. Our assets were at risk. I made difficult decisions to protect everything. Protect. That word again. The same one she had used since Christmas. But then she made a mistake, the kind that happens when someone feels cornered. She stopped speaking to the board and turned toward me. Directly. Her voice dropped. Cold, sharp, personal. You've always resented the responsibilities I had to carry, she said. You never understood what it meant to protect this family. The words hung in the air, heavy, because now this wasn't about business anymore. It was about history. I met her eyes calmly. For the first time I spoke. You didn't protect the family, I said quietly. You protected your control. The sentence landed with a finality that made the room feel smaller. It would later become the line investors quoted most in their reports, because it cut straight through every defense she had tried to build. Rebecca's composure cracked, just slightly, but enough, because now she moved into the final stage. Collapse. Her voice rose, not dramatically, but with sharpness she could no longer hide. You don't understand what it was like growing up, she said. You don't understand what Dad expected from me. Silence fell again, because she hadn't intended to say that. Not publicly, not here. And then she said the words that explained everything. The words she had hidden for decades. The words that changed how I understood our entire childhood. He never trusted you to handle anything serious, she said. He told me years ago that you were too soft to manage risk. The sentence hit like cold steel, because it wasn't about the present. It was about the past, a belief planted long ago. Before I continue, think about this. If you discovered your sibling's betrayal was rooted not in hatred, but in years of conditioning from a parent's expectations, would that change how you saw them, or would it only deepen the betrayal? Because in that moment, I finally understood. Rebecca hadn't created this dynamic alone. She inherited it. She continued speaking, unable to stop now. Dad always said you were meant to have a safe life, she said bitterly. That you weren't strong enough for real responsibility. The board members watched in silence, because they weren't just hearing a business dispute anymore. They were witnessing something far more personal. And then Rebecca said the most revealing sentence of all. So I did what I had to do, she said quietly. I took the risks for the family and made sure you stayed protected. Protected. The same word. But now its meaning was clear. She hadn't just seen me as weak. She had seen me as someone who needed to be controlled, managed, shielded, even if that meant exploiting me. The room remained silent for several seconds, because her own words had just confirmed intent. Not just legally, but emotionally. What she didn't realize was that her statement had also revealed something else. something even more damaging, because by admitting our father's long-standing belief, she had confirmed that he knew about the liability risks years earlier, which meant the planning had begun long before the redevelopment deal, long before the trust amendment, long before Christmas Eve. Margaret leaned forward then and spoke calmly. For the record, she said, your statement confirms awareness of long-term risk management decisions involving Miss Sullivan's trust position. Rebecca froze because she understood instantly what she had done. She had provided verbal evidence, publicly, irreversibly. Before we move to what happened next, I want to ask you something. If someone's final defense exposed their own long-term intent to manipulate you, would you feel anger, or would you feel something quieter, like relief? Because in that moment, I felt neither rage nor victory. I felt clarity, the kind that comes when every unanswered question finally receives an answer. What I didn't know yet was that the board's next decision would happen immediately. Not weeks later, not after further investigation, immediately. And that decision would trigger consequences Rebecca never anticipated. Consequences that would strip away not just her control, but everything she had spent years building. And once that happened, there would be no way for her or my father to contain the fallout anymore. At 3:04 p.m., just 33 minutes after Rebecca spoke those words, the lead counsel for North Star Urban Holdings stood up, closed his folder, and announced a decision that changed the course of all our lives permanently. Based on the audit findings and statements presented today, Daniel Harper said calmly, North Star will immediately suspend all financing agreements related to the harbor redevelopment project. The words landed quietly, but their impact was catastrophic. Because in large commercial development deals, financing suspension isn't just a delay, it's a collapse. Without investor backing, construction cannot begin. Loans cannot be drawn. Contracts become voidable, and every party tied to the project faces immediate financial consequences. Rebecca didn't react at first. She sat completely still, as if she hadn't processed what he had said. Because denial doesn't disappear instantly. It lingers, even when reality becomes undeniable. Daniel Harper continued. In addition, he said, North Star will be referring the certification discrepancies to federal financial fraud investigators. That sentence changed everything, because now, this wasn't just civil liability. It wasn't just business failure. It was criminal exposure. Rebecca's composure broke completely then. What she said sharply, this is a misunderstanding. We can resolve this internally. Her voice carried urgency now. No longer controlled, no longer strategic, just desperate. But Harper shook his head calmly. The Guarantor documentation contains verified falsification, he said, and the internal communications demonstrate intentional misrepresentation. He didn't look at me. He didn't need to, because the evidence spoke for itself. Before I continue, let me ask you something. If someone who had controlled every aspect of your life suddenly lost that control completely, would you feel satisfaction, or would you feel something quieter? Because revenge often sounds dramatic, but real consequences are usually silent. Rebecca turned toward me then. For the first time that afternoon, her expression held no calculation, no confidence, only something raw. Fear. You knew this would happen, she whispered. I met her gaze calmly. Yes, I said, because that was the truth. Not because I wanted her to suffer, but because I understood something she never had. You cannot build stability on deception. Eventually, structures collapse. She shook her head slowly. You could have stopped this, she said. The words came out almost pleading, and in that moment, she moved back into victimhood one last time. You could have signed the waiver, she continued. We could have handled everything privately. That phrase mattered because it revealed her final assumption that family loyalty should outweigh truth, even when the cost is someone else's future. I answered quietly. You didn't ask me to share responsibility, I said. You tried to transfer it without my knowledge. The room remained silent because everyone present understood the difference. Rebecca's shoulders sagged. The fight left her then, and for the first time in her life, she looked smaller. Not physically, but in presence, because control had always been the foundation of her identity. And now, it was gone. But the consequences weren't limited to her, because the investigation would inevitably extend to my father. The trust amendment, the contamination timeline, the forged documentation. Everything tied back to decisions he had made years earlier. 2 days later, at 9:12 a.m., my father called me for the first time since Christmas Eve. I answered, not out of obligation, but because I needed closure. His voice sounded older, quieter. "Natalie," he said, "we need to talk." I listened, without speaking, because sometimes silence is the only response left. "I never intended for things to reach this point," he continued. "That may be true," I said calmly, "but you intended to protect yourself." He didn't deny it. He couldn't, because the evidence was undeniable. After a long pause, he said something I hadn't expected. "I thought you would accept it," he admitted. "Accept what I asked. That your sister was better suited to handle risk," he said quietly. The words didn't hurt. Not anymore, because I had already understood that truth. Not as reality, but as his belief. A belief shaped by years of his own fears. Before we move to what happened next, think about this. If a parent admitted they had underestimated you your entire life, would you want an apology? Or would you simply want distance? Because in that moment, I didn't feel anger. I felt clarity. "You didn't underestimate me," I said quietly. "You misunderstood me." He didn't respond, because he knew I was right. The investigation unfolded quickly after that. Rebecca faced civil litigation from investors. Regulatory agencies opened formal inquiries. Her company's credit lines were frozen, projects halted, reputation damaged beyond repair. My father, though not criminally charged, lost something equally significant. His credibility, his business network, the trust others had placed in his judgment. Because in industries built on reputation, trust once broken rarely returns. But what surprised me most was how quiet everything felt afterward. No dramatic confrontations, no shouting, no final arguments, just a gradual settling, like dust after a collapse. Because the real ending of betrayal isn't explosive. It's quiet, it's distance. It's the moment you realize you no longer need answers from people who never truly understood you. What remained now was the final step, not revenge, not confrontation, but something far more important, rebuilding and redefining what family meant. Because once the truth settles, healing begins, and healing is always quieter than justice. At 6:11 a.m. on the quiet Sunday in early summer, I stood alone on the pedestrian bridge overlooking the Willamette River, watching the first sunlight reflect off the water, and realized something I hadn't felt in years. Nothing inside me was tense. Nothing felt unfinished. For the first time since Christmas Eve, my life was completely my own. The months following the investigation moved slowly. Not dramatically, not emotionally, just steadily, like the careful process of repairing a damaged structure, one beam, one joint, one foundation at a time. Rebecca's world collapsed quietly. Her development company lost its investors within weeks. The harbor project was permanently terminated. Environmental remediation became a government-managed process, removing her from direct responsibility, but leaving her with enormous financial consequences. Civil litigation dragged on for months. Not dramatic courtroom battles, just paperwork, depositions, financial disclosures, the slow unraveling of a career built on control. My father retired completely from the business sector, not formally forced, but practically, because in industries built on trust, reputation is everything. And once that trust disappears, so do opportunities. He called once more before withdrawing completely. Not to argue, not to explain, just to say something simple. "I thought I was protecting the family," he said. I listened quietly, because that sentence had defined his entire life. Protection, control, risk avoidance, But protection without honesty isn't protection. It's containment. You protected what you were afraid to lose, I answered calmly. And that's different from protecting people. He didn't respond because there was nothing left to argue. Before we go further, I want to ask you something. If someone who hurt you deeply finally understood their mistake, would you feel the need to forgive them? Or would you simply feel free? Because forgiveness isn't always about reconciliation. Sometimes it's about release. For me, release came quietly, not in a conversation, not in a dramatic moment, but in something much simpler. 2 months after the investigation concluded, I accepted a new position at a structural risk consulting firm in Seattle, a role focused specifically on environmental liability assessment and redevelopment compliance, the kind of work that transforms lessons into expertise and expertise into independence. On my first day, my supervisor asked an unexpected question. What drew you to this specialization? I answered honestly, understanding how systems fail, I said, and how to prevent that from happening again. Because that was the real lesson. Not about family, not about betrayal, but about awareness. Understanding that trust should never replace verification. And that independence isn't just financial, it's emotional. Before I left Portland, I visited one place quietly, the Harbor Warehouse site, or what remained of it. The demolition had already begun. Heavy machinery stood silent that morning. Large sections of concrete removed, exposing the earth beneath. Dark soil, contaminated soil that had held hidden risks for decades. I stood there for a long time, not thinking about Rebecca, not thinking about my father, not thinking about the past, just observing something simple. What happens when you remove what's unstable? You don't rebuild immediately. You clear the ground first. You stabilize it. You prepare for something better. And that's exactly what healing is. Not dramatic, not fast, just steady, intentional, quiet. Before we end, let me ask you one final question. If someone once tried to control your future, but you ultimately reclaimed it, would you call that revenge? Or would you call it something else? For me, it wasn't revenge. It was clarity. The kind that comes when you finally understand. You didn't lose a family. You lost a system that was never designed to protect you. That line stayed with me because it captured the truth perfectly. On my last night in Portland, I packed the final box in my apartment, closed the door, and stood for a moment in the empty room. No anger, no sadness, just quiet certainty. Because the most powerful endings aren't loud. They don't involve confrontation. They don't require validation. They look like this: a peaceful morning, a clear mind, a future that belongs entirely to you. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever faced betrayal, manipulation, or a toxic family dynamic, remember this: you don't have to fight loudly to win. Sometimes the strongest response is simply refusing to carry what was never yours to bear. And if you'd like to hear more stories about resilience, justice, and quiet strength, stay with this channel, because sometimes the most powerful revenge is building a life no one else can control. And the next story will begin with a moment just as shocking as this one did.